So to create your ice cream scoop, you're going to have a template to work with, a paper, and you're going to need to choose a color of fabric you want your scoop to be, and you're going to need to place the template on the fabric. Please don't place it directly in the center because then all of the excess is in small pieces. If you place it as close to the edge as humanly possible, then you have large scraps left around it that could be used for something else. The easiest way to trace on the felt is the chalk. You can see I'm just rubbing it around the outside of my template. It's leaving behind a yellow line that I can see, but will also eventually rub off so that you don't have any marker lines left over on your felt. Then you would go ahead and use your fabric scissors, which look like this, to cut this out neatly along the edge. When you are finished, you'll have something like this. So with this circle, in order to make it 3D, you're going to need to do a running stitch along the edge that gets cinched up tight to make a rounded scoop. Kind of like I can simulate in my hands here, something like this, but only with some stuffing. To do that, you'll need your needle threaded with a D-knot. You'll need 2 fish knots on the other end. And what you'll need to do is do a running stitch around the outside. It does not have to be tiny, but it should not be gigantic. With your knot on the bottom side, so I'm going to keep this side that still has some chalk showing as my bottom, and my top would be this other side. And I'm going to just work my way around the outside of the circle with my running stitch. So now that I'm done stitching around the outside edge, and this would obviously mean that you already have your decorations or designs on the other side of your scoop. So remember, you're adding sprinkles, you're adding topping, you're adding something to this to make it not plain. We are going to go ahead and cinch this thing up. So if you pull, it's going to start pulling tight around the outside, but it may not be even at first. So your job will be to make it even by spreading that tension all the way around. And of course, we want this thing to be stuffed. So you'll need to pick the appropriate amount of stuffing and stick it in there so that it feels full enough for your scoop. So some people prefer firmer and some people prefer softer. It's completely up to you. It does not matter. You just decide whatever makes you happy. When you are happy, you want to tie this off so that it doesn't come back undone again. So the easy way to do that is with a balloon knot once again. So go under a close stitch on the other side. So you don't want to tie it back over to itself necessarily. Go underneath, leave a little balloon, and pop the back of the balloon. Do it a second time, underneath, leave the balloon, go from the back, pop it, pull it tight. So now you can cut this thread and you have your ice cream scoop ready to go. Now, the cone would be the second part. So after tracing your cone template onto the paper, you end up with something like this. What's different about the cone is that you're going to need to curl it up into a cone shape and overlap the extra piece to give you a place to sew. What's helpful there is using some pins to pin it in place while you're trying to sew it. So once I have it positioned the way that I think looks good and the way that fits my scoop, just use the pin, poke through, pop back out to hold it in place so that it stays the way you want it to stay while you can do the sewing up the edge. So maybe like 3 pins is perfectly fine. And then there are a lot of ways that you can sew this seam together. You can do a running stitch just right down here where my pins are going. You could do a running stitch but instead do horizontal lines across that seam to hold it together. Once you have this sewn together and you have this cinched up, then you'd be putting them together. So Same thing, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could tuck in the extra ruffles into the cone, like so, and sew it in place. Or you could also, depending on how big you made your scoop at the edges, let those ripply parts stick out over the cone, because a lot of times cones have excess ice cream going over the actual bottom part. So that's something you could do as well, but then sewing it in place. What I did to sew mine in place that may be helpful is I went ahead and squished the cone or the scoop inside the cone, and then I stitched between here and each of these little lines of my thread. So I scooched this to the side and stitched those together, and that seemed to hold together pretty well. If you wanted this to show, you just need to put this inside and do the same kind of thing. Maybe stitching across and connecting them both to make your cone stay together in place. Then of course, you're always welcome to add more decorations and designs with markers, with beads, with buttons, with whatever other pieces of felt you think would be interesting, but that would then finish up your ice cream cone.